stately home of millionaire Bruce Wayne and his youthful ward, Dick Grayson.
Help!
Naturally, sir. I'll call him, sir. I'll summon him, sir. I'll call him, sir. I'll call him, sir. I'll beckon him, sir, immediately. All right, Commissioner. I'll fetch him for you. He's just come in, sir. I'll get him for you. I'll solicit his presence, sir. I'll summon him, sir. I shall secure him without further delay, sir. I shall alert him to your call, sir. One moment, Commissioner. I shall expedite his presence. If you'll hold the line a moment, sir, I'll gain his attention for you. I regret to say, sir, Batman and Robin are not at present available.
What? Oh, surely you must be jesting.
Alas, sir, I am not.
Welcome back, citizens, to an all-new episode of the Batcave Podcast. It's your old bat chum, John S. Drew here, and today is January 7th, and on this date in 1903, Alan Napier was born. Now, while he had a wide and varied career in acting and in television, movies, and stage, we here on the Batcave Podcast, of course, remember him fondly as Alfred, millionaire Bruce Wayne's faithful butler. In fact, as I've mentioned in many of the review episodes, Alan Napier was and still is my Alfred. Today, Alan would have been 113, and I'm thrilled to have joining me the co-author of Alan's autobiography, Not Just Batman's Butler, which is available through McFarland & Company, Mr. James Bigwood. James, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, first thing I've got to ask is, I mean, obviously you co-wrote this, you worked in other anecdotes and such into this piece that Alan, spent a lifetime not only living, but then writing about. And then you also were involved in writing other anecdotes and adding pieces that were missing. But you also are, I take it, a Batman fan, because you do mention that your first connection with Alan was watching the TV show. That was your first time. For you, what was it about Batman, the TV series, that drew you to the show?
Wow. Well, I was quite young when it was originally broadcast, so I think I was really caught up in the actual adventure of it, and probably missed a lot of the winks and nods from the writers and from the cast. I think as I got older, I realized that a lot of what I had taken very, very seriously as a child was actually rather funny.
But you were one to notice, as I say, Alan Napier is my Alfred. I know Michael Caine and Michael Gogh, and there's other people who've portrayed him before him and after him and such. But to me, Alfred, the epitome of it, will always be Alan Napier. And he stood out to you as well when you watched the show.
Well, yeah, he did have a presence. And, I watched the show faithfully twice a week. And the first three credits in the opening, the animation opening, were Adam West, Burt Ward, and Alan Napier. So the name sort of got pounded into my head. And I don't know that I would have remembered his name otherwise, but obviously the people who were making the show thought that this was the third most important person in the show. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been where he was. So I think that's part of what really called him to my attention. And he seemed like such a nice guy, which it turns out, of course, he was. But and it was one of the things that he said to me, that when he was approached by children who recognized him on the street, he always got the feeling that they related to this very nice man who would always be there for Batman and have milk and cookies and whatever was necessary to keep him happy.
And now here's the interesting thing, though, because like in the work itself, and I want to touch on the, obviously I want to talk about the book, but before we get into it, I want to talk about one aspect that Alan himself didn't get into great detail on. He talked about it, but he didn't get into great detail, was just the whole character of Alfred himself, because when he got the role, it was written one way. He portrayed it differently, and the writers took to it very quickly, it seems. And it's not at all anything like even what we're used to seeing in the comic books, because I've been reading some of the old 1940s comic books, and that Alfred on TV and the Alfred in the comic books are two completely different characters. So what was the whole, impetus that he went to such lengths? I mean, he really changed the character around.
Well, he didn't go into detail with me when I spoke with him, and he doesn't, as you say, go into a lot of detail about it in the book. Other than to say that he did, in fact, not play the part the way it was originally written. And when I spoke to Lorenzo Simple, he told me that they picked up on what Alan did and just developed it based on what he was doing from week to week. I know one of the things that he felt was very, very important to having the part work is that he had to play it completely seriously, because it was so ridiculous, the whole situation, that if he actually made fun of it, then it wouldn't work. So I think that that's probably the most important aspect of how he played it, which was total sincerity.
Now, the book is large. It is detailed, but not complete. You do fill in some of the gaps. I assume he didn't get to finish everything he wanted to write.
Well, he finished it in 1971. There's actually, as you read the manuscript, his manuscript, which I've cleaned up a little bit, but there's places where he refers to something in the present tense, and you realize he's talking about 1969, and then later on he says something in the present tense, and he's obviously talking about 1971. So it was around that period of time. In the early 70s, he finished the book. Now, I met him in 1975, and he lived to 1988. He didn't go back to the book. Once he finished it, it was finished as far as he was concerned. So what I added to it was, I think, things that he may not have thought were all that important, but that I know that people that are fans of him now, beyond Alfred, enjoy him in. I mean, for example, he never mentioned the mole people. A lot of people enjoy him as the high priest of the mole people. So when I spoke to him, when I interviewed him, I did bring it up. He had a little bit to say, and so I took what he said from my original interview, and I did bring the mole people into the book, although in his mind probably it was not a high point.
Right.
The work that I did has all been done in the last 3 or 4 years, long after he died. And it was because his daughter was kind enough to let me have the manuscript and let me see what I could do to get it published. I first read it in 1975 when I first interviewed him for a career profile, which eventually appeared in Films and Review. And I kept in touch with him beyond that. And one thing he was always great about, he encouraged fans by always answering their letters. So I have a lot of what I used to fill in the intervening years between the finishing of the book, his finishing of the book, and his death, come from letters that he wrote me. And anybody who wrote him could be sure to get an answer. And it's actually, his handwriting was atrocious and very hard to make out, but he would handwrite letters to all of his fans.
Wow. And the book, like I say, it's detailed. There are 3 volumes, and he says it himself. First covering his early life, then his theatrical life, and then basically his American life, television and movies and such. Now, he not only had a rich acting life, but his background is interesting. His whole family life. I mean, as most people know, or I shouldn't say most, but many people know, he was first cousin once removed to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He goes into detail about his family background. Now, knowing us Americans, as he's writing this, and our penchant for the more lurid. And even goes on to say how, he himself isn't, hasn't done a major crime or slept with anyone famous or something. Why did he choose to go into such details about the family?
Well, probably it was that he felt it a very important part of his life. And certainly it's where he came from and what brought him to where he wound up, for better or for worse. And he doesn't mince words. There's aspects of his childhood and his young adulthood that he was, very unhappy about, and never particularly fond of his mother, although he acknowledges her instilling a love of words, of poetry, and of reading out loud. But he says that she had no ability to show love to her children. So he, as a young man, first of all, developed a terrible stammer. And in addition, as we can see from seeing him on the screen, he was very tall. He was 6'6", and he got tall quite young. So he was a very awkward, gangly, stammering boy. And that's essentially what he says, is that's how he got into acting, because the only way he could not be this awkward, gangly, stammering boy was to be playing somebody else. And when he was somebody else, he didn't stammer, because Alan stammered, but the character didn't stammer. And so I think a lot of what how he was brought up got him to the point. And of course, the earlier section of the book, when he talks about his family, he also does talk about going to the boarding schools that he went to and his early acting experiences as a child. So again, I think he's laying the foundation for how he got to where he was. And I think also the aristocratic background that he grew up in. He was, what they call a poor relation. So his family didn't have any of the money, but they were all raised in the style of people who had money. And a lot of what he was able to do on the stage in his early career had to do with that background and being able to play those kinds of people.
Now, his mother, like you say, not capable or incapable of love. He didn't have that presence in his life. He also brings up his older brother, who was a bit of a bully. He's away at school, and the British boarding schools were not particularly known for their warmth and affection as well. And yet, the person we see on screen, the person we read in this book, is a very warm, approachable person, he seems. He seems like he's capable of a great deal of affection, including, the love he shares with his wife in the book and such. So how do you reconcile the two? I mean, what was it, or who was it, that brought about or engendered this in him? Because he's a remarkable person considering his early life.
I think he just took what he was given and learned from it and grew from it. I think making the move from England to the United States, I think sort of making a new life and meeting new people. Certainly his political, he was not a loud, active political person, but his politics were left of center. And when he came to the States, he hung out with people whose politics were more left to the center than he originally was, and I think they molded him and his. I think he was always open to change. I don't think he was the kind of person who felt that this is what it is, and I'm damn it, it shouldn't be any different than the way I remember it. I think he was always willing to accept input from people that he met, to take the good and recognize the bad and build himself with that.
I love the anecdotes about his appearance in Orson Welles' Macbeth. And in telling some of the stories, he certainly confirms that, as much as Welles was considered a genius, he could also be a little on the odd side. But in his talkings with you, did he ever comment on the changes Welles made to the story? Because, his own character in Macbeth is not one that appears in the play.
He was very impressed with what Welles did with Macbeth. The character of the Holy Friar, which is what Alan played,
right.
It was not a role that was created out of whole cloth. All the lines that he had were just taken from minor characters or other characters, not so minor, that Welles had either cut already from the script, but he needed what they had said, or that they had, because he had cut another big chunk of the script, he needed something to tie it together. So it was Shakespeare's words. It was just this new character that Welles had cobbled together. And from a stylistic point of view, Welles was trying to contrast the good of the Holy Friar with the evil of the Macbeths. So it was a choice in order to put his interpretation of the play to the forefront. And Alan was very impressed with that. He did not take it amiss. What he said to me was that the English critics were much more accepting of what Welles did than the Americans, paradoxically, and that it was true to Shakespeare and to the original Macbeth. It wasn't something that was imposed on. So he was quite happy with it.
Now, I'm a big Macbeth fan, so that's why I had to ask that. I teach high school, and my favorite Shakespeare play to teach is actually Macbeth. To me, I always tell the kids that, in terms of taking your Regents or your SATs and you have to write an essay, I said you can always use Macbeth as an example to solve the problem or answer the question, because Macbeth asks so many of the questions of life as it is anyway. So I've seen the production that he did, the movie version, with the weird, out of sync voices and such like that. So it would have been something to have seen the stage production as well.
It's interesting. I've just been reading Patrick McGilligan's book, Young Orson, which it goes into great detail about Welles's maturing from a little boy to the man who made Citizen Kane. And in going into detail about the voodoo Macbeth that Orson Welles did in New York in the 30s with an all-black cast,
yes,
he did a similar thing. He really rearranged the text considerably and molded it to the story he was trying to tell. And of course, his Chimes at Midnight is taken from 5 different Shakespeare plays. So it wasn't unique to the movie Macbeth that Welles rearranged his original source.
Yeah, I've got to see the last 5 minutes. They have a clip of it up on YouTube of one of the stage productions of that version of Macbeth. And long before, as everybody gets all twisted up about whenever you do a modern version of Macbeth and they're carrying guns and such, the cast there in the 1930s were carrying guns instead of swords.
Indeed.
Yeah. Now, turning to Batman, as we said, he doesn't go into great detail. And in fact, you actually write a lengthier piece. Now, when you were talking to him about the autobiography and such, did you ever talk to him or ask him why he didn't go into as much detail? One would think that you might see more. And in fact, the title of the book, was that his title?
No. His title was Footsteps in the Sea, which is a poetic quote, an allusion, which, the whole idea of you can't make footsteps in the sea, they always fill up as you take the next step. But the title was mine. And really, because if I put out a book called Footsteps in the Sea by an autobiography of Alan Napier. A lot of people who know Alfred don't necessarily know his name was Alan Napier, and so it was really a bow to the necessity of letting the people know who this book was about, and you know, that aspect of the marketing of the book. I didn't ask him why he didn't go into detail on Batman in the book, but I think, you know, maybe there's a hint of it in the way he tells how he got the part. You know, his agent called him up, and the agent said, Alan, I think you're going to be Batman's butler. And Alan said, what on earth are you talking about? And his agent said, well, don't you read the comic books? No, never. What on earth are you talking about? You're going to be Batman's butler, and you'll even get to drive the Batmobile. Bobby, that's ridiculous. Why don't trouble me with this stuff? But Alan, if it's a success, it could be worth well over $100,000. Of course I'm Batman's butler. And he told that story with, you know, that was one of his party pieces, and I've seen it told in slightly different ways in people's interviews that were published elsewhere. And he's not ashamed of the fact he did it for a paycheck when he got the part. Now, once he took the part, I think he didn't just phone it in. He wasn't just collecting the check. I think he did everything that he could to make it interesting and, as good as it possibly could be. But I think that if he was looking back at his life, it was not probably one of the things that he wanted to most be remembered for. I think he said to me, he really enjoyed the recognition. He enjoyed working with the people that he worked with. I know he enjoyed making the money. But what happened afterwards, essentially it destroyed his career. Because once he had done Batman, he was typecast. And that was after decades of not being typecast, which is an unusual thing in Hollywood. You know, some of the great people that we remember because they did the same thing over and over again in a lot of different movies, and they did it brilliantly. But Alan, in one movie, what could be a mine foreman, very low-class character. The next movie, he is an ambassador. He was very much of a chameleon and very versatile. As a result, he was never particularly famous until he did Batman. And once he did Batman, and once it was behind him, he couldn't get arrested. In those 15 years that he lived after he finished Batman, he did 19 roles on television, never did another feature. And of those 19 roles, 3 of them were butlers. He'd never been a butler before he did Batman. Although William Dozier, in an interview, said, I cast Alan Napier because in my mind he's the epitome of the English gentleman. But I think he was saying that with the benefit of hindsight because Alan, as I say, had never played a butler before.
And yet, in that time, those how many years was it you said between Batman and his passing?
Batman, 68, so 15 years.
15 years. Okay, so in those 15 years, he also, as you say, though, was always willing to answer letters, seemed to be cordial about talking about the experience, whereas, you'd hear stories about Adam West or Burt Ward at various times, because they also dealt with the stereotyping, seemed to be on the bitter side. But also, he never took advantage of his persona as Alfred the way the two of them did, where they would continue to make appearances. He didn't do the personal appearances, did he?
He didn't. I don't know whether it's because nobody ever asked him. He did do one Batman reunion right before he died.
Right.
And that was in 1988. I mean, actually the year he died, and it was not a particular success. It was Ross Schaefer's Fox late night, and they had crammed so many people into the show that by the time they got to Alan, there was about a minute left, and he had had a stroke and was not. I mean, he could speak just fine, but he needed to have a moment to gather himself, and he never got it. So it gives the impression that he really couldn't talk at all, which wasn't true. But I think, at the time of the show, I mean, Adam West and Burt Ward even then were doing personal appearances, and given the fact that they were not making much money in the show, Burt Ward made less money than Alan did.
Yes.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
And so they were making their money going out and doing personal appearances even when the show was on. And then afterwards, I think Adam West claimed that he tried to escape it, but sort of got drawn back into it. At a certain point, it was the only way they could make money. Now, Alan's right after the show was canceled. Alan was 65. He started collecting Social Security, and he had a nice chunk of change in the bank from having done the show. So he was perfectly capable of making a living, or making his life on the money he was making. And whereas, Burt Ward was probably was still in his early 20s and had an entire life ahead of him that he had to make money with. So that may have been part of it. But again, I don't really think that he was asked. The two stars of the show, Adam West and Burt Ward, and they would go and open supermarkets and all that kind of thing because they had the fancy costumes and they could drive in the Batmobile. And all Alan could have done if he had gone to one of those things is sort of stand in the background the way he does on the show. There's not a sort of an Alfred-type entrance
right
that you can make, whereas Burt Ward and Adam West can come in with their capes flying and make an entrance. But Alan was just sort of quietly there in the background. Of course, as the show progressed, he started to have to be more involved in the plots and take on some of the crime-fighting responsibilities. But if he had gone to the opening of a supermarket, or if he'd gone to an auto show with the Batmobile, I don't know what he would have done.
Actually, it's interesting now that I think about it, because you say in the book that Alan was at the beginning the second highest paid, right behind Adam West, and then Burt Ward was after that. And by the time we get to the third season, Stafford Rep and, I can't think of his name now, Commissioner Gordon. Neil Hamilton were being paid more. And I guess it kind of, not that I'm trying to say that they should have been paid more than Alan, but I guess it kind of makes sense then, because I always kind of scratched my head when it came to the third season. I get the fact that you're trying to create more, like, where the stories have to revolve around the other characters because you're trying to, have a tighter budget and such like that. So instead of having some other millionaire being robbed this week and Batman stepping in, it's more like Bruce Wayne will be robbed. But they beefed up the roles of Stafford Rep and Neil Hamilton as well. So I guess that's...
They did, but what's interesting is that because of the way they set things up, Alan was, first of all, everything was crammed into a half an hour instead of 2.5 hours.
Right.
So everything was compressed. But Alan, or Alfred, was the only person who knew who Batman and Robin was, and practically at the beginning of the season, he very cleverly discovered who Batgirl was. And he sort of became a liaison between them without either of them, or any of the three, knowing that he knew about the other ones. So he actually he was there more. Now, I think that the reason that he didn't make as much money in the third season as Hamilton and Rep is probably because he didn't push very hard. And there's stories in his book about early on he auditioned for the role of the Marquis of Shane in Noel Coward's musical, 1929 musical, Bittersweet. And he had He was called for an audition. He was, in 1929, he was 26 years old. The character is 65. He made a great career in his youth of playing old men, but he had sometimes to do some convincing that he should even be given an audition, because here's this 26-year-old boy coming in and he wants to play this 65-year-old man. But he made himself up and got on the stage, said a few words, and Noel Coward asked him a question from the audience and then told him to come and talk to him, and he was given the part right then and there. And the show manager sort of ran into him as he was coming from the stage to the house and asked him what his rate was. And he says in the book, he way undersold himself. And he ended up doing that show for 2 years, and he would have made a lot more money if he had a little bit more confidence in himself at the time. Or if he'd had an agent do it instead of himself, or whatever. Now, by the time he was in Hollywood, he had an agent, of course. But I think he was happy to have a regular paycheck. I think if he had known, I'm sure he didn't know he was making less than Neil Hamilton at Stafford Rep. But if he had known, he might have made a bit of a stink. But he was making more money than he made in the first season, and he was quite happy. And the truth is, he didn't have to work all that much. He would perhaps, in some cases, do all of his work in one day.
Right. Yeah.
In those episodes, and then just stay at home and work in his garden and play volleyball on the beach, which he loved to do. So I think he was quite happy during those 3 seasons.
So let me ask you, in the end, you've known the man himself, the actor, and then we know him as Alfred. How do you sum up Alan Napier?
I think what you saw was what you got. He was... You see him in Batman again, which is where I first became aware of him. And you saw this kind, open person who cared about the people that he, in the case of the show, worked for. In the case of his real life, I think he cared about the people that his friends, his acquaintances. He was never a Hollywood type in terms of scrambling to get further and further up the ladder or to get invited to the next best party. A lot of his friends didn't have anything to do with the business. He told me a story, and this maybe is a very good way of summarizing his take on life. As I said before, he loved to play beach volleyball, which you don't kind of think of when you think of a tall, dignified English actor playing beach volleyball. It's kind of, what's wrong with this picture? But when you think about the fact that he was 6'6", that does sort of tie in with being a volleyball player. But he would play all the time, pick up games on the beach. He lived in Pacific Palisades, and he could walk to the beach from his house. But he was doing a production of Dial M for Murder in mid-50s in La Jolla, down near San Diego, the La Jolla Playhouse. And he came back, and his wife asked him how it all went. And he said, well, the play was fine, but you know what it's like to go to the beach and get into a volleyball game and be known as Big Al from Santa Monica? That's what really was my high point of my week in La Jolla. And I think that sort of sums it up. He was happier. Well, of course, he loved being on the stage, and he loved his job, and he loved the art of what he did. But it was just as wonderful to be accepted in a pickup volleyball game on the beach in La Jolla.
He sounded like he was a really remarkable man. I wish, and I've said this before, I've never had the chance to meet any of the cast from the series, even though I've done this podcast now for a couple of years. I really wish, though, I'd had the opportunity, because he was my Alfred. But, James...
Well, I think...
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I don't think anyone has improved on him. I think he was the original. I guess there was an Alfred in the 1940s serial. I've never seen them, but certainly 120 episodes of 1960s Batman, Alfred is Alan Napier.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Now, how can people get hold of the book, not just Batman's Butler?
McFarland, it's McFarland and Company is the publisher, and you can buy it on their website. But it is on Amazon.com, and it is on BarnesandNoble.com, and so that's probably, those are the places that people go to buy their books these days. Very easy to find. You can just put in the title or his name, and it'll come up. And thank goodness.
Well, folks, we'll definitely put links up for the Amazon page, because we also, have our little Amazon shop set up there. So we'll put the book into the shop if people want to get a hold of it there. We'll have it on the show notes on the website itself. Now, James, what about yourself? If people want to follow what's going on with you and your writings and other activities that you're doing, how can they follow you on social media?
Well, I'm afraid I don't have a personal page, but I do have a Not Just Batman's Butler page on Facebook, and I put everything up there. If you take a look at it, you'll probably see sometime in the next day or two an announcement that I'm going to be on your show. Okay,
there you go. Well, then, and we'll also put links up for that as well, so people can find the page and like it on Facebook. James, thank you so much for taking time out to share with us, your experiences with Alan and such, and for being a part of this book here. I mean, it really is great, folks. I mean, it's quite a read. I loved it, though, and I didn't think at first I would. I loved the very beginning, reading about his early life and his childhood, and just, how sad in some ways it was, though, and seeing him overcome it.
Well, thank you, John. I really appreciate, first, the invitation to be on, and secondly, those very nice words about the book. It was a labor of love, and I had the opportunity to meet him, and I read it back then. It was always in the back of my mind, and I always was hoping that sometime somebody would figure out a way to let more people read it, and I guess that ended up being me.
Yeah, thank goodness it was. And as I say, I'm glad for it. So, folks, stay tuned. We've got more reviews coming. We're working on the third season there, and I'm sure, we'll have some more special episodes like this one here on the Batcomputer. So until next time, citizens, thank you so much for listening. James, chums, take care, everybody. Thanks for listening, chums. I don't have a bat phone, but you can contact the Batcave Podcast through its Facebook page, Twitter, email at the Batcave Podcast at gmail.com, or by phone at 888-866-9010. Subscribe to the podcast via Libsyn.com, that's Libsyn.com, or through iTunes. The Batcave Podcast is part of a series of pop culture podcasts from the Chronic Rift Network. Find them at chronicrift.com. So until next time, citizens, same bat time, same Batcave Podcast.
Where's Bruce Wayne?
Mr. Wayne is not at home, sir.
Too bad. I'll get my revenge later. Right now I'll settle for cash. Where's the safe?
My duties do not include aiding and abetting thievery.
Oh, no?
I see. This way, sir. Please be calm, madam.
One peep out of you, now blow your head off. Where's the safe?
Over there.
My, you poor little thing.
Behind the picture, sir.
There's no safe there.
Alfred, be careful. The Joker's an arch criminal.
I know, madam, but a very poor fencer.
You Anglo freak, I'll smash you to smithereens.
May I point out that smithereens is a childish institution which should have no place even in so poor a vocabulary as yours.
back! Stand back, I say, or I'll... Ah! What's this? Don't touch that! Ah! A secret passage!
Alfred, what's happened? I'm afraid the Joker accidentally tripped the Batpo switch and mistook this for a secret passage, sir.
Then he's down in the Batcave.
He didn't quite make the Batcave, Master Robin.
Then where is he?
I believe he should be arriving presently.
Emergency Batpole elevator. Fast thinking, Alfred.
Thank you, sir.
Someone get me off this crazy dumbwaiter! I can't breathe!
Joker says he can't breathe, Alfred. Why don't you give him some breathing space?
With pleasure, sir.
It's lucky you didn't get around to washing our other costumes, Alfred, or else Joker might have found himself wearing a bat costume.
I think we better see about baby Jane Towser. Alfred, it looks like you can handle things here.
I believe everything's well in hand, sir, and the young lady's in the living room.
Alfred, old pal, have pity!
We Anglo-Finks have a long memory. Really shouldn't take pleasure in another creature's misfortunes, but occasionally one may be forgiven for a slight twinge of satisfaction.